Alrighty, let's go ahead and get started with Solid Wednesdays Session 2. So for those of you who are not here for this workshop, you're welcome to stay around. We're going to be leading kind of like a training session for Viking Motorsports to get people familiar with SolidWorks. You're welcome to listen in, participate if you would like. But yes, that's what's going on right now. So let's get started. Today's session is mostly going to be focused on sketch tools and kind of drawing stuff in 2D, and maybe we'll get to 3D sketching a little bit as well. But for the most part, we're going to be doing interactive stuff, so make sure you get logged in, open up SolidWorks. All these computers should have them. Let me know if you need help with that. And everybody see the link in the Discord and how to download SolidWorks on your own computers from the cat?
I didn't, but I heard.
Okay, cool. So if you do need to download it yourself, check the Discord. It should be in the announcements channel. I might post that again after today's section, or maybe in the live stream description. We'll see. But yeah, let's go ahead and close out of this. And then you guys catch that QR code to check in as well? Should be the same QR code as for everything else. So.
I was just going to
Cool. Yeah, check-in works as well. All right, so we'll hop over into SolidWorks. And this time I do have the stream open as well, so if anybody's watching live, I can watch their comments. All right, so let's go ahead and I'll open up a new part. Just click New, and then from the basic templates, click Part. Huh?
Are we doing it together?
Yeah, we're gonna. I mean, you guys are welcome to follow along. I can just breeze through stuff, but it's probably better if you guys follow through, so that way you guys can kind of get a feel for the software as well. We're gonna start a new sketch, and we'll start it on the top plane for now. Just that we. Doesn't matter too much. We're really just going to be going over all the different tools and stuff that you have access to, or might make some, something that resembles a part on the Formula car, but for the most part, just kind of drawing stuff around. So if you remember to our last session, we talked about topology and geometry. So for the most part, all the tools you have are for creating topology, and then you have those dimensions and relations to create, to actually turn that topology into geometry. So we're going to start off just by talking about basic lines. They're very straightforward. You got this drop-down toolbar here up at the top once you've started a sketch. By default, it gives you just a normal line. So pretty straightforward. Start with one point, drop another point somewhere else, and now I have a line. Once I've placed that line, it's going to want me to place another one. If you kind of saw that there, go ahead and reopen that command. So I'm going to start here, and then it's going to want me to place another line. So I can do this, just kind of start drawing out whatever kind of shape I need to make. And then once I close the shape, it stops drawing lines. So that's kind of one of the neat things. What I like to do when I model parts is I like to just kind of go draw out all of my lines wherever I need them, and then go through and dimension them rather than doing it one line at a time. So that's really handy with the line tool. It automatically is like, all right, you're probably making a shape that's not just one line. I'll just keep going and all this, and it automatically adds in, kind of connects these 2 points together for you. So it's kind of nice. It does that. So let's say that I wanted to click on one of these lines. Again, I've created some topology here. 5, 6 lines here, and now I have some options to kind of start, messing around with this stuff. Let's see, out to the left side here, you got, kind of in our properties here for the line. It's going to show us relations if we've already added some in there. But here are the relations that I can add to it. I can add a horizontal and a vertical, and I can also fix this line. We're going to pretend that the fixed relation doesn't exist. I want you guys to ignore that. Never use it unless you have a really good reason to use it. Fixed just basically makes it so that the geometry doesn't change, and whatever it is when you draw it, that's what it's going to be like. So it's fairly bad practice to take your sketch and just define it just by fixing everything in place. So we're going to pretend that doesn't exist, and we'll talk about when you would want to use the fixed relation at a later point. But one of the nice things with SolidWorks is, let's say that I kind of get turned around in my part. I forget which way's up. So, and then I go to kind of constrain this line here. Let's kind of draw like that, right? So I go to constrain this line here, and I'm like, all right, am I going to do it vertical or is it horizontal? I don't know. I don't remember which way is which. If I look on the left side here, vertical is more bold, and that kind of gives me a hint. It's like, hey, this line is closer to vertical than it is to horizontal. So if I were to snap that to vertical, it'd go there, and then if I were to undo that, went horizontal, it would go further down. So, and then you can kind of see up at the top here, once I've added in this horizontal relation, it shows up here. So I can go back, and at any point I can look at how many things that I've added to this line to make it constrained, and then I can also just go in and just by pressing the delete key, I can remove that relation to make this line free to move around again. So that's what we have there. In terms of points, don't really have as many relations. You can kind of fix them. You can also give them an XY coordinate. So as you start to lay stuff out, you can kind of say, hey, I want this roughly to be there. I can just punch those coordinates in here. One thing to keep in mind is with these coordinates and with lines, we actually have like values for the dimension or the length and the angle, is that they don't actually fix that geometry. It's just as you're drawing it in, like I want to draw a line that's roughly 90 millimeters. But then I actually have to go in and add a dimension to actually make it stay at 90 millimeters. It's just to kind of be drawn in. So again, if I change this to 75 here, probably need numlock on. There we go, changes that. But then I can still come in here, drag this point, and make it back up to 115, whatever. So that's kind of the properties for our lines. And then we have these two options here for our lines. We can make it construction geometry. We can also make it infinite length. Infinite length isn't going to be super useful here. Kind of straws that out all the way through. It's very nice for like center axes or something like that. If you know everything's going to revolve around a middle axis, but you don't want to define the length, you can kind of do infinite length. Construction is super handy. Basically, if we're going to be drawing kind of stuff in and want stuff to relate to this certain line, we can make it as construction geometry, and then that way, you can kind of see that this area isn't shaded in, so it's no longer a profile. I need to add, a couple more lines to make it a profile again. So that could be, you can use construction lines for a lot of different things. We'll kind of show why you'd want to use some later on. that's kind of the basics with lines. Lines kind of introduce a lot of the basic parameters. So we have fit dimensions, we can fit angles to them as we start to draw them in, but they still get dragged around, and then we can add in those relations, make this line vertical, this line horizontal. This line, I can't make either of those because it's going to try to drag that point around and try to make that zero thickness. But regardless, that's kind of what we have for those. Any questions about lines so far? So far, so good? All right, cool. So moving on. Just delete all those. Moving on to different kinds of lines. So notice this is a drop down. It's not just one kind of line. We have a couple options. We have a center line, and basically all that really does is it draws in a construction line. It's nothing more, nothing less, but it's very helpful sometimes to start with a center line, and then, if I'm drawing in other lines, then I can, like again for that cup, if I want to make a cup, I can draw in that, and then add in another line up here. So now I have my center line that everything's going to revolve around, and then I have the outside edge of my cup here. So that's kind of useful. You can also just use it just to automatically add in a bunch of construction geometry if you're like sketching stuff out and building stuff in there that isn't actually there. And then midpoint line is another useful one. So again, if we're creating kind of symmetrical geometry, sometimes creating a midpoint, or like if you want to center your part around the origin, it basically starts your line at that point and then draws a line both ways. Fairly handy. You can also create midpoint lines just by making a normal line. So I'll kind of show that here. So we made a midpoint line there. I'm just going to go back and create a normal line, just like that. And then I'm going to click that line and then the point that I want to be the midpoint, and then on the left here I can see some relations that pop up. So we haven't seen either of these yet. One of them is a midpoint, so that's what we were kind of talking about. Makes it coincident to that midpoint. The other option that we have is just coincidence. That just means that this line is always going to pass through that point, but it's not going to be symmetrical around it, right? So I can make one side short, other side long, and that gives me those options there. That's really all there is in terms of basic lines, at least for now. I will come back to another feature in a bit. Then we have, let's go to rectangles next. Rectangles give us a bunch of different options here, which is fairly cool. So sometimes you can just draw in, instead of drawing in 4 lines, you just go to the rectangle tool and start with that. Corner rectangle and center rectangle are the two most often used. And then SolidWorks will remember which one of these you used last. So, let's say that I drew some corner or center rectangles a bunch, and drew some other stuff. I come back, it's going to remember that I drew a center rectangle last. But starting with corner rectangle, it starts at the corner, place the other corner, and it kind of shows you that in the tooltip here. Those 2 little white squares, going to be kind of hard to see, probably, but 2 little white squares. That's where you're placing your points. On the center rectangle, you can see that one of the points is in the middle. One of them's at the top left corner. So that kind of does that. And so, kind of create your 2 different options there for rectangles, at least the 2 most common ones. But going back to some options here, let's say corner rectangle. Anytime that I start any rectangle command, SolidWorks also gives me these tooltips here. So I can actually change, even if I started with corner rectangle and I wanted to actually do center, I don't have to go all the way up here. I can change it here. And then it gives me the other options for corner points and all that kind of stuff. Then it gives me this option to add construction lines. So these can be fairly helpful if you are, again, trying to add in other relations and figure out where your geometry is relative to other things. So it can automatically add in construction lines. Then you have 2 options, from corners or from midpoints. And I'll show you both here. So there's the from corners one. You can see it added in 2 construction lines from each corner. Also added in a point at the middle. So let's say that I wanted to make a circular cut right through the middle of this rectangle. Gives me a nice reference point to put that circle, for example. So that's one way you can use those. Also from midpoints is another option. Instead of going from the corners, it goes from the midpoint of each line or of each rectangle. Again, it's basically just SolidWorks adding in extra geometry or extra topology in there for you, extra lines for you to reference off of when you go to start adding on stuff than just the simple rectangle. So those are the two basic ones. And then the other thing that you're going to notice is that as you click on these rectangles, they're already going to have vertical and horizontal relations. But let's say that I didn't want to draw a horizontal, or a rectangle that's perfectly aligned with my XY plane. I have a couple other options. So again, clicking that rectangle tool, I have these two options here. I have 3-point corner rectangle and 3-point center. So just like those two rectangles above, you just have an extra third point, and that's what kind of decides the angle of your rectangle, or kind of the angle of those lines. So you draw that first line, and then you draw the second line, mirrors those two lines over to the other side. Same options to add in construction lines there if you wanted to do those as you're drawing, and then center rectangle, starting from the center of the rectangle and then kind of expanding outwards. Again, just options for drawing rectangles at angles to other things in your parts. Same kind of options that we have here. We can define stuff by XYZ points for the corners, XY for each corner point, and then your center point as well. And then the last option that we have to draw rectangles is a parallelogram. Fairly straightforward. Not too much there. And then this one looks like it already drew in a horizontal relation there. I want to do something like that. None of these have relations except for these parallel ones. So that's another kind of relation that you can add between lines. Is just two different lines. They're both going to be parallel. Kind of great way instead of making both of these have an angle dimension of the same value, you just make one of them parallel to the other and dimension one angle. Any questions about rectangle tools? Straightforward, right? Circles are the next one. So these are kind of the three most common tools you're going to use: lines, rectangles, and circles. Circles are fairly straightforward. You have two main types. You have one where you start at the center, draw out, and then another one where you pick 3 points and you draw a circle around that. This one, or the 3-point one, is very rarely used. I probably have only used it maybe once in like a very rare case. But for the most part, usually you'll just start with your normal circle, start at the middle, draw out to a point, and then you can fix that point to be wherever you want it to be. So like this point, right now this one's fixed to the origin, but that's kind of what you got there. Circles are fairly straightforward, fairly simple.
Can you not have a construction for a circle?
What kind of construction line would you have?
The actual circle.
Oh, you can make the circle construction geometry.
Oh, okay, I didn't see it.
Yeah, so it's gonna be you have to click on the circle itself, and then you get the options. Yeah, off the left side. The only kind of geometry that automatically gets added in as construction is lines. Right? Lines gives you the option to be drawn in as construction, and then rectangles give you the option to add extra construction geometry. Yes, that's what we got there. And then under circles, yeah, it's just the circle and the perimeter circle. And then I guess we get to let's talk about arcs. So first I'm just going to go in and draw a rectangle here real quick, just because it's going to make things a little bit easier to visualize and remove those construction lines too. Cool. So with arcs, we have a few different options. One of them is a center point, one's a tangent, one's a 3-point. Tangent arc, I'll show you a little shortcut on how to get to that in a bit here. But we'll talk about center point and 3-point first. I guess for those I didn't really need the rectangle. But center point, we start with our first point, and we start another point, and then we start to draw our arc. And then if I want to draw the other way, I kind of hover over that point where I started, and it lets me start drawing, kind of going around like that. And then sometimes you kind of have to hover over it a few times to get it to do exactly what you want. But yeah, so that's kind of your options. That's one of the ways to define an arc. Is if you know your center point, draw your other, your radius, and then you define your angle. Other way is to define your diameter first. So 2 points, and then you start to figure out how far, this kind of curves up or down. So this one would be fairly handy, like on this rectangle, if I wanted to round out one of the edges. I just click the 2 lines there, and then it doesn't tell me how exactly I'm rounding it out. I can kind of bulge out to make a full circle theoretically. But let's say that I did want to round out this edge. What that means is that either two things. Either this is tangent to that line, or actually that this point in the middle is coincident with that line. So if I go off to the left here, click coincident, kind of rounds that out, so it makes this tangent. You have a couple different ways to define it there. So yeah, first one, center point, starts at the center point. Other one is a 3-point arc. So you're basically just drawing 3 points on the circle, starting with the 2 ends of the arc, and then kind of defining your curvature of it. And then last one, tangent arc. This one has to start at the end point of a line. And then, like in this situation where we have a corner, sometimes it gets a little bit tricky. You have to kind of start to draw out to which side that you actually want it to go, and then start to curve it over like that. So you can see that it starts, and then if I exit out of this arc here, it has this tangent relation that it's automatically adding into that line. So as it transitions into the arc, it's always going to be tangent at that point. And that's very useful. Like again, if I'm drawing drawing this line, and then over here I have this other line. I want to connect them with a tangent arc. I just click on that line, go down here. And the other thing to note is that it only adds a tangent relation at the start. So it's not going to add one at both ends. You actually have to go in and add the second one in later. But just like that, I can make a tangent arc right there. Any questions about arcs? Simple, right? The other cool thing, and this is one that I want.
Sorry,
go ahead.
I do have one.
Yeah.
You see the arc that you have on the right side of the square?
Yeah.
Is there a way to not make it it's basically a semicircle right now?
Yep.
Can you like shrink it?
Yeah.
So that it.
Yeah. So this point here.
So
the center of or the center point of the arc, I made that coincident to that line. If I click on this relation and delete it, move. Oh. Yeah, there we go. I can actually move that point around. It's kind of finicky. Didn't want to let me do it, but yeah. Let's see. Added another 2-point arc there, or 3-point arc. 1, 2, 3. So that can be there. Also move it inwards as well. But yeah, and SolidWorks is a little finicky, and that doesn't really want you to move that in, but usually you want to draw in your stuff fairly close to what it's actually going to be like. So if I know that I want it to be kind of like that, I'll draw it in to be fairly similar to that, and then add in my relations from there. And then the last thing with arcs, like I said before, there's a little handy tooltip that we're going to talk about with lines. So this kind of geometry down here, where I have a line, an arc, and then another line, is actually really, really common. SolidWorks built in this feature a long time ago. So basically, let's say that I scoot over here and want to draw some lines. So I'm going to start a line, straight, and then I want to add in this curve, but I'm drawing a straight line right now. So what I do is I go back, hover over the point. You can see that it's going to turn into like a circle icon at the bottom of my tooltip cursor there, and then that's going to show me that, hey, I'm drawing an arc now. Boom, just like that. And then once I start drawing again, it's back to a line. If I want another arc, hover over that point. Another arc, hover over that point. Again, sometimes it's kind of weird and starts to go out other ways, so you just hover over that point. And then you just want to make sure that once you're hovering, you go in the direction of the arc. And then here, and back to lines, whatever else. So super handy, really quick way to kind of draw in your rough profile when you have lines and arcs together. And then you can go through and define, sometimes it'll automatically add in those tangents for you. It will automatically add in those tangents for you because you are kind of referencing right off of that point. Tangent, tangent. There's tangent here as well, and tangent up at that line. Of course, I can make it so that I'm drawing curve, line. There we go, curve. And then I can draw this line going off that way. It's not going to give me a tangent relation there, but it will give me one at the start of my line. So that's super handy. Really quick way to draw a lot of complex, curve and straight geometry at the same time. And then other than that, we have a couple of more advanced, or actually I guess let's cover fillets real quick. So another different way of adding in kind of that sketch geometry or those curves. So we'll start with a center rectangle, draw that in, and then I can go in and make all those corners curved. I have these options for how, or basically my radius. Click on all the points that I want to make, make that radius go. So let's make it 100 millimeters because it's automatically scaling right now. I can click on the points. I can also click on two lines. So I can start with that line and then go between that. So that's handy if you have a bunch of different lines connecting at a point and you want to figure out which two lines you want to fill it between. So just click on one line, click on the other, adds that in. So that's one way to do that. And then it only makes one dimension for all four of them, which is also really nice. We'll kind of get into dimensioning and adding relations to all your sketches here in a bit. But keep that in mind. Adding in all the fillets in one go makes one dimension for all of those fillets. And the other option that we have, so let's say that it didn't do fillets there, I can also do a chamfer. So instead of a rounded, it's just like a broken corner. And then I have a couple options here. Distance basically says, from that corner, how far in do I go? Most commonly, you'll have an equal distance. So in this case, let's bump this up to 100 millimeters so I can kind of see that. Boom, just like that, 100 from each, and it's linked together. You can also make it not equal distance. And in this case, you do want to use that situation where you select one line and then the other. So I'm going to select my first line. That's the one that I want to have a 100 millimeter break on. And the second line that I want to have a 200 millimeter break on. And then my other option is to give it a distance and an angle. So in this case, break that corner, 100 millimeters, and then 45 degrees. And then again, if I want to make that angle steeper, shallower, whatever else, let's say 60 degrees. Usually when you're not doing equal distance stuff, you want to do that first line and the second one, so SolidWorks isn't guessing for you. But yeah, there we go. So 100 millimeters there and a 60-degree break.
Does the shape have to be underdefined in order to?
Nope, it can be fully defined. Yep. And we'll kind of talk. We'll bring that back up. So remind me if I don't cover it, but yeah, it'll add in certain relations and other things once you try to chamfer stuff. Any other questions so far? Cool. So that's pretty much all the basics that you're going to use. Other than this point command, just gives you the option to drop a point wherever. Fairly straightforward. Sometimes you don't need to draw a line, or maybe you need to add in another point along this line to help define it. So kind of, for example, let's say that I wanted to, this is going to connect to something else later on, and I know it's going to need to be like 350 millimeters from that point, and then this point's going to have to be like 200 millimeters, right? And then that way kind of split it up instead of having to do all that math, or if I want to create other geometry off of that later on, it's nice to add in those extra points early on. And then with points before, if I will place that point on the line, I want to make sure it's the midpoint of it. I can go in just to add in that midpoint relation. So now I have a physical point that's on that line that I can reference that's coincident to that midpoint. Right. So on to some of the more or less frequently used features. There's a Polygon Tool. So if you're building more than rectangles, pretty handy to use this. Gives you a couple of options on how it kind of starts it out. Interestingly enough, it does give you the for construction option for this shape, where it doesn't give you that for rectangles or circles or anything like that. But going in here, we're basically just going to be creating a six-sided, or we're going to start with the hexagon just as an example. And then you have two options: Inscribed Circle, which means that it's going to kind of define this based on a circle that's within the polygon, or a circumscribed circle, which means the circle is outside of the polygon. So different applications there. But kind of for this case, basically what it boils down to is what you're dimensioning off of. So for this, we're going to be dimensioning off of the flats. So if like you're measuring the head of a bolt, you're going to be measuring from those two flat parts of it, and then you can dimension the circle to be that same exact value. If you're measuring between points, towards the corners of these, then you're going off of the circumscribed circle. You also don't have to use the circle itself to dimension the polygon. You can just dimension one of the flats, and they're all going to be equal to each other. Let's say 50, and I'm just going to move this over to the origin just so that it helps define itself. And the only other thing to remember with polygons is it doesn't automatically create like a horizontal or vertical reference. So as I start to spin this around, you want to be all wonky. So I'm just going to make this horizontal real quick. You can see my sketch is fully defined just from that one dimension of that flat, or from my dimension of this circle, for example. Dimension of my circle, there we go. So I measured it to be 100 millimeters around all the flats. So, got that. Yeah, Polygon Tool, fairly rarely used, mostly for like heads of bolts or places where you're going to be putting a nut in, like an inserted nut, or something like that. Or if you're creating kind of more complex geometry, like a stop sign would be a good example, I guess. Want to make all 8 sides of the stop sign the same dimension. Slot command is another one of those rarely used commands, but fairly more frequently than the polygon, I'd say. And like with the rectangle, you have a bunch of different ways of defining it. You have a straight slot that starts at the 2 points, straight slot that starts at the center, and then you have curved slots as well. So we'll start with this one here. It also gives you options to automatically add in dimensions as you're drawing them in, which is kind of handy, especially for the slot ones. Sometimes it's a little bit harder, especially to get this dimension, like the overall length of the slot. So I'll kind of just add this in here just as an example for you guys. So I run with 2 lines, and then my thickness of my slot. Oh, I forgot to click add dimensions. Let me do that real quick. So slot, add dimensions, overall, boom, 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 and you can see it plops those dimensions in the overall, the length of the slot and the width of the slot get populated in. I can go in and change these up. Maybe this is a 120 millimeter long slot and it's only 30 millimeters wide. Cool. So it kind of saves you the process of drawing line, arc, line, and then adding in the geometry to make this all coincident to wherever you want it to be. Just kind of draws in that construction line automatically for you. It gives you a midpoint to reference off of too. So super handy for kind of creating slots. Happen if you have like an adjustable part where it's fastening and kind of slide it around a little bit. So that's kind of your option there. And then I think that covers those shapes. Oh, yeah, we have ellipses as well. Ellipse, partial ellipse, parabola, and conical shapes. So these are more mathematically defined. Very rarely have used these in my own personal experience, but just for a basic ellipse, just to demonstrate, draw in your major radius and your minor. And you kind of you can add in those dimensions here just to give you kind of some control as you're creating the ellipse, if you know roughly what it's going to be like. And then to dimension it, you can dimension it off of these points that it automatically adds in for you. I think that covers just about all, or no, we still got to cover splines and then text. Let's just cover text real quick. It's a fun one. So text is kind of a pain to use in SolidWorks until you kind of understand how it works. So it gives you this option here for curves, text that you're going to be putting in, and some font files. So it gives you the document font, the default here. If you uncheck that, you can control the scaling, and you can go in and kind of change whatever font you want. We'll use Comic Sans, for example, here. And then before I actually do this, I'm going to go ahead and sketch in a line just to illustrate how you usually want to use text. So I'm going to draw on this line. Because the line isn't actually going to be any geometry, I'm going to make it a construction line. That's usually good practice. And then I'll add in this curves drop down, I'm going to click on that first, and then I'm going to click on the line. So now I'm going to start typing text. It's going to follow that line. And then again, if I don't want to use document font, make Comic Sans. I can define my font either in terms of point, kind of 12-point font, whatever else, that arbitrary number, or I can actually define the actual height of this text itself. So 10 millimeter high, for example, as your default kind of font spacing or font height. And then of course I can go in and make it kind of all stretched out. One thing to notice is as you start to go past that line, it starts to delete letters. And then I can also scale, kind of decrease that spacing between there as well. So this is the width of the text itself, and then this is the spacing between each of the letters. So it's mostly just, if you're adding in kind of embossed text or something like that to your part itself, it's a good way to kind of space it out, to fill whatever space you need, and also to follow a line here. Again, if this doesn't also have to be a straight line, it can be an arc. So I'll just draw one of those in here just to illustrate. Again, making this construction geometry because I'm not using it to actually extrude that actual line. Click on this curve, and then Michelin, for example, if I'm adding entire letters, space it out a little bit. If I downloaded the Michelin font, I could stick that in there, or whatever else. So, fairly rarely used, I'd say. A lot of the parts that you're going to be sending out for machining, for example, aren't going to have text on them. It's very hard to machine text. But if you're modeling parts, that kind of, I don't know, for 3D printing, it's a good one. Just adding in kind of like, hey, this part was made for Viking Motorsports or something like that. You'll see that on a lot of commercial, it's kind of a good idea to mark your parts, or part number embossing, for example. If you have a particular part number assigned to it, that's kind of your options there. And then last one that we want to cover in terms of our basic tools here for creating sketch geometry is splines. So if you guys remember when I was talking last week about how to create kind of this mouse shape where I'm interpolating between, I'm trying to I have these defined lines and then I'm kind of guessing at what's in between. That's kind of what splines do. So I'm going to draw a 3-point spline just so that kind of helps illustrate defining those 3 points. And it's going to keep making you define points as you keep going. So once you've got your points, just exit out. And what it's doing is it's taking the position of the start point, middle point, and end point, and interpolating in between to make a nice smooth curve. But I have options to control it. So if I click on that line, it's going to bring up these gray arrows, one for each point, and then it's going to give me a bunch of different options here as well. But we'll just start by dragging around some of these arrows and start to see how it changes. So you can see fairly drastically as I make this point and its direction, basically what this is controlling is the influence of this specific, what we call a spline handle, or a spline control point on the curve. So this is your handle here. It has a direction and a magnitude. So basically, it's a vector. It kind of controls how straight your line is at that point, or how kind of in what direction it goes. And then the more and more force you give it, or the more it controls that line. Control directions. You can also make these. You can give these relations. So, like, let's say that I wanted to make this vertical. So that right at this point, basically, the line or the slope of the line is vertical, and it has this particular magnitude associated with the dimension of that vector. You can dimension these. It's kind of wacky. I personally haven't figured out exactly what those dimensions mean. I'm pretty sure it's just the curvature value at that point. But again, just by moving around these points, I can get all these organic interpolated shapes. It's just kind of guessing at what's there by moving around these spline handles. And it kind of boils down to, if you have a particular shape you're trying to get at, you're gonna just be fiddling around with these spline points until you get it basically just right. And then, of course, you can make tangent relations. If I had a straight line off to this side that was horizontal, kind of see added in that horizontal relation there. Make the spline tangent to it, and so then that just basically moves the handle
so it's horizontal now. Can't really move it up or down. And then I have this point to control. So when I was making the steering wheel model, I used a lot of splines in a lot of places to kind of get that organic curvature. I know that it had to kind of start going this way and then just follow and go through this particular point, and then just tweaking the spline handles to get it to fit basically exactly how I wanted it to. And then that kind of brings me to a point of how splines in general, they're not fixed geometry. They're underdefined. So you add in as much definition as you feel is necessary, like these relations to make it horizontal at a certain point, to make this point be in a particular, at a particular location in your XY plane, or in this case XZ, or wherever you're drawing your sketch. And then you adjust it and tweak those spline handles. And if you want it to stay a particular way, you can just start assigning dimensions to them. So I'll just assign a dimension to this. There's my curvature value, or that's actually probably my radius of curvature. So I can kind of start adding stuff in if I needed to. But splines are pretty powerful. You do a lot of really cool organic shapes with them, but they're very kind of complicated. And again, the more points you have, the more flexibility you have in your spline, the more control you have over it, but also the more kind of interpolation is going on behind the scenes to actually make it work. And then another kind of thing here is what's called a style spline. And this is just a different way of looking at splines. Instead of having just your control points, you have this, what they call a control polygon, that you can kind of drag around to help kind of define where your spline goes. So that's kind of just another option of how to add them in. If I add in, yeah, so it's just kind of moving stuff around there. And then an equation-driven curve is the last option. So if you know that this curve has to follow a specific equation, you've modeled it before, you can kind of do that. So a really neat application of that is a visualization for like 3D graphs. A couple of professors, or one of the professors that I took a math class with, had somebody 3D print them a saddle point. So a point in a 3D kind of equation where the curvature, you basically have a local minimum and local maximum in two different directions. So just to kind of see that, and it was kind of a neat way to, again, we're basically just creating an equation-driven curve. It's a fairly simple application of it, but you can kind of go further from there. So that's kind of all of our basic sketching tools. There are a few more that are kind of more hidden, but that's kind of all you really need to know to start designing, probably 99% of your geometry and topology. So I think let's take a quick break. I need to let my voice rest for a little bit. If you guys want to go grab some water, we'll kind of talk about some of these tools for modifying sketches and start to get into how to define them with dimensioning and relations. So do like a 5-minute break real quick, and then we'll go from there.